Great, thank you very much for that. Good morning, everyone, and thank you to the organizers for the opportunity to present today, and to all of you for attending and for your time and your comments and what I'm sure and I hope will be an interesting discussion following the presentation. My name is Caitriona Dowd. I'm a PhD candidate in Trinity College Dublin, and my research focuses on violent Islamist groups, cultural demography, and emerging threats is what I'm looking at today in the context of Sub-Saharan Africa. And I'm going to begin by giving a brief overview of the Armed Conflict Location and Event Dataset, because the data I'm presenting today will be drawn from that, and I want to talk a little bit about how it's collected and structured so that you can engage with some of the terms and methodologies that I'll be using. I'm then going to outline my research question, defining in particular what I mean by Islamist, and outlining some observable patterns which make this what I believe to be an important and timely discussion, particularly in the context of Sub-Saharan Africa. And I'm going to provide a little bit of background to the academic research which has been done in this area to date. Thereafter, I'm going to go through the research design and some preliminary findings on this topic, and then make some concluding remarks about implications of these findings and open up the discussion for talk about future research, but also for your feedback and your questions. So the Armed Conflict Location and Events Dataset, ACLED, is the research project from which today's data is drawn. It's a publicly available dataset of political violence in Africa, and it dates from 1997 to the present. And I'm involved in overseeing the collection and publication of data, in addition to producing reports and profiles and special focus topics such as this discussion of Islamist violence in particular. The data is broken down in a number of different ways, and the most significant is by violence type, so whether or not we're looking at an event that involves civilian targeting, a clash between armed groups, or a political demonstration or protest, and also by actor types. And the latter, actor types, allows us to analyze the activity of specific groups, such as Al-Shabaab or Boko Haram, generic groups by categories that we construct ourselves, so Islamist groups, for instance, or actor types more generally, so rebel groups or state forces or militia groups. And finally, what ACLED actually measures, and I think it's important particularly in this context of very dynamic kind of conflict and violence, is political and not criminal violence. So we're looking at acts of violence between armed groups or targeting civilians that have a political goal or a political agenda. So some of the wider activity in which Islamist groups are involved, such as smuggling, for example, particularly in the Sahel, some of that activity would not be captured in the data that I'm presenting today, but it's an important part of the wider discussion. And finally, the constituent parts of the data and what I'll be referring to today in terms of the level of conflict and the intensity of violence that we see are discrete events. So every act of political violence is coded as an individual event, and these are what make up, as I say, the levels and intensity of violence I'll be referring to throughout, and these are the units of analysis in the quantitative tests later on. So very briefly, in terms of discussing this methodology, the advantages of using the data is that it's an excellent supplement to qualitative knowledge and triangulation of sources on conflict and security. It allows us to compare conflict across contexts, time, and forms of violence. In the context specifically of looking at actor-specific violence, it allows us to look at Islamist groups, for example, and how they might differ from other forms of violent actors active in Africa, and how those profiles or those activities by those groups might diverge or share similarities. It also allows us to facilitate a sort of prioritization in terms of where we see conflict escalating, where we see conflict intensity, and how we identify drivers of conflict or ways to mitigate or address conflict based on different criteria. And the data is updated monthly, so there are frequent updates which allow us to make a discussion and have a discussion about conflict in almost real time. So the data that will be presented today runs up to about March or April of 2013. And then briefly, in terms of the limitations, the data is primarily based on publicly available sources. So there is always the potential for some bias, particularly in contexts where there's limited freedom of of media or limited civil society activity. Not all of the data is drawn from media sources, but that is an important factor to take into account when we're considering the potential for bias in reporting. Urban and rural data, sometimes there's a divergence there, and there's also the potential for bias, in particular in terms of fatalities data that is often very, very contested in terms of reporting. So that's important to bear in mind when we're talking about the intensity of conflict as well. So with that methodological discussion behind us, it brings us to the research question today that I'm going to be talking about, and that is if and how cultural demography influences the emergence and activity of violent Islamist groups in Sub-Saharan Africa. Essentially from this we want to know, do violent Islamist groups emerge in states with particular ethno-religious characteristics, for example, the size of the Muslim population, the diversity of the population in that area, or the growth rate of the population in a particular region? And the reason we're discussing this very broadly is that we know that violent Islamist group activity is increasing in absolute and proportional terms. It's emerging in new areas in Sub-Saharan Africa, and it's strategically and politically and economically important. So that's both globally and in the areas of operation of these Islamist groups through the effect of conflict on political stability and development. And finally, in an academic context, it's important to talk and to our understanding of how identity and conflict interact and the conditions in which those two interact and how they shape and influence one another. So before we move on, I think it's important to define the terms that we're going to be using today. And by Islamism in particular, there's a sensitive issue of associating any kind of political violence or political action with any kind of religious group. And so it's important to state that in this presentation, Islamism refers to the proactive promotion or enforcement of Islamic ideologies, laws, policies, or customs. Now that's a very broad group of actors who fall under that category, and violent Islamist groups are a subset of Islamist actors distinguished by their use of violence towards these ends. They are not synonymous with Muslim militants or with Muslim-identified violent actors. By those categories, Muslim militants may be active in a range of political violence or militant groups which are not pursuing an Islamist agenda and within which their religious affiliation is not a primary identifier. Muslim-identified violent actors, by contrast, are primarily informal, often spontaneous rioters or militia groups who, by the informal nature of their organization, do not have an articulated ideological framework for their actions. Furthermore, as those groups are informal, they rarely have an explicitly articulated membership. So they're largely defined and identified as composed of Muslim militants or Muslim members by secondary sources. So observers, security sources, or media reports which identify these groups as being composed of Muslim members. So in that way, they're distinguished from self-identified Islamist groups, which would have an explicitly articulated agenda. So from that basis, if we look at ACLED event data, we can observe that Islamist activity is increasing both in absolute and proportional terms in Sub-Saharan Africa. And what we see here is Islamist violence by country between 1997 and 2012, and we can see a very large, very sharp increase over time. Some of the increase that you'll see in 2012, some of the increase that you see in 2012 has been due to, in part, methodological changes on the part of the project where we've switched from historical data collection to real-time data collection. So I'm conscious that that may result in better collection over time and therefore an increase in event numbers that we're picking up. So in order to try and address that and control for that potential inflation, we can also normalize the data to 100% and say what proportion of violence on the African continent is Islamist or Islamist related. And we also see an increase over time here. So it's highest in 2012, and that corresponds to conflict in Somalia at that time, the intensification of conflict around Mogadishu, but it's been increasing over time since the late 2000s. So we're looking at a phenomenon that's increasing over time and something that's becoming more prominent. So, in addition to the actual level of violence that we're seeing, we're also seeing it emerge in new spaces, and that includes a spread southward, eastward, and an intensification of Islamist violence in West Africa, where it has traditionally been present, but certainly has increased there. And what you're looking at in this figure is individual instances of Islamist activity in 1997, 2002, 2007, and 2012. So snapshots over time, over the course of the data set, to highlight how this phenomenon has changed. So what those very, very simple observations show is that we're looking at something that's growing and something that's changing. So it's emerging both in the sense that this as a phenomenon of violence is emerging in greater numbers, but also emerging in that it's transforming and changing into new theaters, new areas of conflict, and new communities, and affecting different populations as a result. So a number of different academic approaches and theoretical approaches have been utilized in explaining either the increases specifically in Islamist violence that I've just described, or in the conflict research and conflict area more generally, using different explanatory concepts and mechanisms. And that's what I've outlined here very briefly. And none of the works that I've referenced are suggesting monocausal explanations, so very few of them put forward a single explanation. But what I've tried to do is indicate where they place the greatest emphasis in terms of their explanatory work. So that's what we see here in terms of the factor and the mechanisms. So the most straightforward factor, the first sort of category of explanations, is Muslim population size, sort of full stop, which is related either to cultural explanations or to not defined or not specified mechanisms that suggest that are not explicitly articulated. And cultural explanations might fixate on the idea that Islam as a religion or a cultural phenomenon is prone towards violence or condones or encourages it in some way. So that's one school of thought. The second looks at religious diversity as a category of explanations, in which it's proposed that competition between diverse groups or a lack of social capital across groups privileging members of one's own group contributes to conflict. In a third category, differential growth between distinct groups is related to conflict. In this category, diversity itself is not the problem, but what Horowitz calls apprehension about the numbers or a fear of extinction is a driver of conflict. In a fourth category, we're looking at group marginalization, relative poverty, relative deprivation, and these are proposed as explanations of conflict, either specifically in terms of Islamist or Muslim-identified communities, or in conflict more generally. It's a very prevalent theme in the conflict literature, and it relates to how socioeconomically, or in terms of access to resources or status or power in a country, different cultural groups might engage in violence as a means of improving their conditions or as a reaction to what they perceive to be marginalization. And then in the fifth category, we're looking at identity salience. So this is the fifth category of theories that are related to conflict research, but also to political and developments more generally in multi-identity environments, that looks at the dynamic importance of identifier categories at different times. So how individuals may identify by religion or by their ethnic identity at different times, depending on the political or social circumstances in which those identities become important. So from this, I've drawn up 6 hypotheses or assumptions to be tested, which I'm going to look at through the data. So the first is that countries with large Muslim populations experience more violence, and this is very simply related to the population size of Muslim populations and whether or not there's more violence as a result of this. The second is that religiously diverse populations experience more violence. The third is that greater divergence in population growth rates for Muslim and non-Muslim populations lead to more violence. The fourth is that higher rates of socioeconomic marginalization, predominantly Muslim communities, will show higher rates of violence. The fifth is that at higher rates of recorded state corruption, predominantly Muslim communities show higher rates of violence. And the sixth is that ethnically diverse populations experience more violence. So the models are structured as follows. I use ACLED event data throughout. I look at total violent events, so all general and all conflict events across the Sub-Saharan African region, Islamist events and Muslim-identified events as separate categories. I include different measures of population size of Muslim populations, including not only the absolute size or the proportion that the Muslim population is of the overall population, but also whether or not they're the dominant religious group and whether or not they're the absolute majority in terms of the population. I test this using negative binomial regressions and logit models, and I'm actually just going to talk through the results. I'm conscious of the different interests and different backgrounds that the people are coming from, so I'm going to talk through the results of each of the hypotheses without actually presenting my data tables, but if people are interested in more the technicalities of the model specifications, I can certainly provide that as well. And finally, I'm testing on what's called the admin level 1 scale, so that corresponds roughly to the province or district, so it's a subnational unit. So instead of looking at the entire country, I've broken down the data where available to the statistics and the data and the variables at the subnational level so that we can look at the difference, for example, between northern and southern Nigeria. So our first hypothesis was that countries with large Muslim populations experience more violence. And in this context, I found no relationship between total violence and Muslim population levels. So on a very simple level, the percent or the size of the Muslim population is not related to overall political violence in a country, and we can largely reject cultural theories which suggest that Islam, for example, has, quote, bloody borders, in the words of one theorist. The second is that we found a strong positive relationship between the size, dominance, and Muslim population majority and violent Islamist events. So this relationship might reflect a range of factors, such as the ease of recruiting in a Muslim majority context, wider support in the population for the actions of Islamist groups, and so forth. It's difficult to identify a mechanism from this result alone, but what it does show is that violent Islamist activity is not typical in Muslim minority contexts, which is a common question or a common theme in identity-based conflict research, so that a minority perceiving itself to be under threat might rebel, for example, against a government that it feels is not representative. So we know that that's not the typical context in which Islamist violence occurs. So there's a difference in those theoretical approaches and the way that we should approach looking at violent Islamist activity. And finally, we find that a weaker but a still positive relationship and significant relationship between size, dominance, and Muslim majority and Muslim identified events. Our second hypothesis related to religiously diverse populations experience more violence, and we find a significant negative relationship between religious diversity and total conflict events. So in terms of conflict literature and where this would sit, in terms of previous findings, some theorists have suggested that in very heterogeneous societies, it's more difficult, in fact, to recruit or to get support from a population that is very diverse. And so that may be one of the explanations for why total political violence or overall political violence is not related to religious diversity per se. In terms of Islamist events, which is our primary interest here, we see a negative relationship between Islamist events and diversity, except if society is diverse and has a Muslim majority or Muslim dominance status. So if the Muslim population is the majority or is the dominant religious group, that area is twice as likely to experience Islamist violence, holding all other factors constant. And finally, Muslim-identified militia and rioting are also more common in diverse societies. For hypothesis 3, we looked at divergence in population growth rates for Muslim and non-Muslim populations, and we found that this was insignificant in total events models, so it was unrelated to overall violence, and it was also insignificant in Muslim-identified rioting and militia activity. However, it was positively related to Islamist events, and that result was robust across count, logit, and also proportional models. So that held across various different tests that divergent growth in Muslim and non-Muslim populations, primarily Muslim and Christian populations at the subnational level, led to more violence. Hypothesis 4, at higher rates of socioeconomic marginalization, predominantly Muslim communities will show higher rates of violence. And so this related to a number of different theories around relative deprivation, around marginalization across cultural groups, and how that might be linked to conflict or violence in a society. But this returned insignificant results for all event types and all models. And this is possibly a question of the data and how best to capture marginalization. So in common with a lot of the literature on relative deprivation and marginalization or inequality across different groups, it's very difficult to identify an effective proxy for marginalization that is showing the kinds of results that we might qualitatively or in terms of case studies expect to see. So in this case, I tested marginalization through infant mortality rates and relative infant mortality rates. That is to say that areas that had higher than average infant mortality rates for the national average were considered more marginalized, because that's usually an excellent proxy for poverty. But it might be the case that in this case, poverty isn't the primary way in which people feel marginalized. So it may be that political aspects, for example, representation in government or access to power or resources, particularly in a political context with what might be considered a zero-sum game of winner takes all in politics, that marginalization is experienced through different means, and it's not a simple question of poverty at the communal or the local level. So we can return to that in our discussions for future research. Hypothesis 5, similarly in terms of marginalization or sort of the impact of governance on the emergence of violent Islamist groups, we tested whether higher rates of recorded state corruption, predominantly Muslim communities, showed higher rates of violence, and we found no significant relationship in Islamist event models, either logit or negative binomial models, but a very strong and highly significant relationship in logit Muslim-identified militia and riot events. So in some of the models, Muslim-identified events showed a significant relationship with higher rates of corruption. And finally, hypothesis 6, at higher rates of ethnic diversity, predominantly Muslim communities experience more violence. In general, there was a positive relationship between ethnic diversity and Muslim-dominated areas for higher total events, but that's likely driven by the second finding, which is that there was a very strong relationship between ethnic diversity in Muslim-dominated areas and higher Islamist events. And this was not related to Muslim-identified militia and rioting activity. So, interestingly, this is one of the tests in which the measure of the Muslim population size was quite sensitive and relevant to the results that we got. So in Muslim majority contexts, ethno-linguistic fractionalization or ethnic diversity did not meet the significance threshold. So the result it returned, it still had a positive relationship, but in terms of the p-value or the statistical significance, it didn't meet the cutoff point for significance. But it was very, very clear in Muslim-dominated contexts. There was a strong and significant relationship. So it suggests that there is a difference in terms of how the dynamics of power and the dynamics of demography are experienced between holding an overall or an all-out majority of the population being of one religious group, and that group simply being the largest, that dynamic is different and does affect the experiences of those populations. So the big question is what does this mean? And when we return to our research question, do violent Islamist groups emerge in states with particular ethno-religious characteristics? we can conclude two broad conclusions. And the first is that political violence generally, so total violence, Islamist violence, and Muslim-identified violence have discrete patterns. They occur in different conditions, demographic, political, and social, and we can therefore infer that they have different drivers. So they should be treated both in terms of an academic and a theoretical approach, but also in terms of the policy community approaching these different types of violence as discrete phenomenon. To speak of conflict-affected societies as a general category is fine, but in terms of the findings that we've found here, it underscores the importance of treating these as discrete categories of conflict. The second big finding, or the big conclusion we can draw from that, is that Muslim population size is not a simple driver of conflict. So demographic factors have to interact with economic, political, and context-specific conditions. It's not simply a case that culturally or for other social or political reasons, the phenomenon of Islam itself is violence-prone or experiences or witnesses more conflict than elsewhere if we hold those factors constant. And that is in part revealed by and illustrated by this graphic here, where on the left we see the areas at the subnational level with the highest levels of violent Islamist activity, and you'll notice that it's northern Nigeria and also southern Somalia that experience the highest rates, and on the right-hand side we see areas that experience the highest rates of Muslim-identified events. So there's some overlap clearly in terms of the areas that experience these, broadly speaking, but there's also a very divergent patterns, which speaks to the importance of understanding at this subnational level what the different drivers of these different types of conflict are. So beyond these broad conclusions, there are also some take-home points in terms of how we understand Islamist violence and Muslim-identified violence itself. So we know that from this, Muslim-dominated areas experience more Islamist violence, or are likely to experience more Islamist violence if they are religiously diverse, in which case we said that was twice as likely to experience that. If they're also experiencing divergent growth rates of Christian and Muslim populations, and also if they're ethnically diverse. So beyond those categorizations and those primary findings, there are they point to some interesting avenues for future research. And the very first point, and one that I think we can't escape when we're talking about these broad categories of Islamist and Muslim, is that we need to unpack these terms and understand what they mean and what the differences are within them. So these are referring to very broad and very diverse groups, ideologies and actions within these. Intra-Muslim violence as well is a common phenomenon. So talking about diversity only in terms of Christian and Muslim diversity is limited in terms of what it can tell us. So it's important to unpack these categories and look at how they might be concealing divergences in action and ideology. It's also important to look at how divergent growth is related to Islamist violence. So we've identified a clear relationship, but how that mechanism is actually mobilizing Islamist group activity is important. So whether or not these groups are drawing on this dynamic in terms of narratives of fear and apprehension, and whether that's building support or whether it's more effective in terms of recruitment specifically for militants, is an important thing to identify and to understand. And finally, ethnic diversity and how that's related to Islamist violence. I think in terms of the theoretical approaches as well as the policy community approaches to how we understand this type of violence, it's incredibly important to look at, again, the mechanism by which this is taking place. So whether it's a question of the appeal of a unifying ideology or an identity in a context which is highly divided otherwise, or whether or not we're looking at the strategic identification of the most important or significant identity mantle at that time. These are important things to look at and to understand moving forward, and to take these findings to the next step in terms of our research. So that's my presentation, and those are the findings. I welcome your thoughts and your feedback, and I want to thank you for your time and particularly your patience in terms of my brief absence. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Caitriona. A good presentation. And while our guests are typing their questions in the chat box at the bottom of the screen, and we already have a couple few, let's start from the top here. Let's see. It says you've covered some of the potential biases of the database. Could you provide a bit more detail as to the source? Is it some UN commission, or a careful reading of readily available news reports, information put out by governmental sources, or is it some other group, or some other group tasked with generating the data?
Thanks for that question. In answer to that, it's almost all of the above. So the data is collected through a range of sources, and those include media sources, so careful readings of news reports and news wires in particular, and local and international sources, as well as civil society organizations such as NGOs and international organizations, human rights groups that are active in across Africa and across conflict-affected areas, and a certain amount of security updates, for instance, in terms of travel updates or security on the ground for NGOs and international actors operating in particular in Somalia and Nigeria, but elsewhere as well. So the vast majority of our data comes from those sources. We collect and code the data in-house, so internal to the project, so it's not another organization that's tasked with collecting it. And we keep a track and a record and publish information on where the data comes from, the source of the data, and also the type of source that is. So we try to analyze and control for any potential bias that might be inherent, for instance, in international sources, prioritizing, for example, urban violence, or prioritizing conflict between armed groups rather than targeting of civilians, for example. So we produce reports on the nature and the structure of our sources so that we can be as transparent as possible to try and control for any of those potential biases.
Okay, great, thank you. Here's another question. In your opinion, or based on your research, how does Islamist violence in Africa correlate with militarization of Africa, specifically increased U.S. presences in Africa, like Joint Task Force Horn of Africa, or large-scale U.S. exercises with African militaries?
I think that's an excellent question. I couldn't speak to the specifics of it correlating, because I think the militarization of Africa is something that, you know, in technical or quantitative terms, is something that I wouldn't be comfortable talking about in terms of a measurement. But I do think there's a relationship between the sort of securitization of a certain space and the ways in which actors engage with that. I don't know that I think it's necessarily unidirectional. So some analysis might suggest that greater international engagement in Africa has led to a sort of a reaction in the form of Islamist groups reacting to this notion of an external force. I think that's one way of, that's maybe one dynamic, but I think it's also more complex than that. So I think that in addition to this idea that international forces active within Africa are maybe experiencing a reaction against international engagement on the continent, there are also actors who are recognizing the strategic significance politically of identifying themselves as Islamist, and that may also be something that we're seeing. So that would explain why the securitization, or the perceived securitization of Africa correlates to an increase in Islamist activity. But part of that may be the strategic decision of groups that were otherwise involved, for instance, in violent activity, but had not chosen to identify themselves clearly as Islamist in a way that would garner them a lot of attention. So I think there are complex dynamics going on there, which aren't always reflected in discussions of sort of international presence in Africa. provoking some kind of reaction. I think it's more complex than that.
Okay, great. And specifically, how do your findings help explain the situation, what's going on in places like Nigeria, Somalia, and Mali? How does that inform those situations?
Thank you very much, and I think that's the big task in terms of explaining, in terms of trying to explain what's going on the ground and trying to make this policy relevant and also relevant to what we're seeing in very real time. I think in terms of Mali, Somalia, and Nigeria, the importance of looking at identity in very divided societies is underscored by the findings here, and understanding that as a driver and as a possible reason why Islamist groups are garnering support in otherwise highly divided societies. So I think I would put that as a strong finding from the research, and also something that really resonates in terms of our qualitative knowledge about those contexts. The second thing I would say is that, particularly in the context of Mali and Nigeria, it's also interesting as an example of the challenges of this research. So I went into this research expecting to find that poverty, higher levels of poverty, were strongly correlated to the instances of Islamist violence, and that wasn't the case. That hasn't been the case in a very simple measure of marginalization, which is, as I said, infant mortality. And yet, in our qualitative understanding of these contexts, we see that it's extremely central to the narrative of why Islamism and violent Islamist groups were active in northern Mali and also in northern Nigeria. So that's a very central part of that discussion, and yet we don't see it reflected in this one single measure. So I think it points to the importance of understanding marginalization in a multidimensional way, and trying to understand when communities or areas experience or understand themselves as marginalized, that there are different ways in which that can take place, and so that these variables or these measurements of marginalization need to try and integrate that.
Okay, and in the course of your findings, you mentioned a lot of different types of demography, and Dr. Matelitz brings up a good point about there's a very powerful study that shows that poverty in Pakistan, it finds that poverty does not have an impact on violent Islamist activity. How does that mesh with your findings in Africa?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Again, it matches very well with what we've seen, and that poverty is not directly related to or correlated to higher instances of violence by Islamist groups. And I think it's one of the central challenges of how we try to understand these conflicts and the complexity of them. So as I mentioned before, it may be a question of measuring marginalization and socio-economic marginalization in a different way. So communities may feel that that government investment, central government investment, for instance, in an area, or representation or involvement, integration of particular communities into the central government are more important measures and more important steps to take in terms of integration. But what it does speak to is that it's not simply a question, for instance, of development in a narrow economic way, that if northern Nigeria or northern Mali were more economically developed, that would be a simple or straightforward way to address or to ameliorate the conflict that's going on there. So it's more complex than that. The other thing I would say is that poverty, often in terms of looking at deprivation or relative deprivation and inequality, the political dimension is marginalized to a certain extent and is neglected. And I think that Nigeria in particular, which has had a very complex system of rotating between different communities in office, different regional representatives in power at the federal level, is a good example of how political access to power, not a concrete or a sort of a measurable level of development or wealth, but political access to power is a really important an important aspect in terms of stability and conflict mitigation. And clearly there were issues around the sustainability of the arrangement or that sort of rotation within Nigeria, but we can also see that there are implications when that system breaks down, and I think that's what we can kind of take away from that.
Great, thanks. And just one more question, and this is kind of the $100 question that I was really thinking is, what do you see with your findings? What are the policy implications for the United States?
Thank you for that question. I think in the first instance, there are implications in terms of how we frame our understanding of these contexts for everyone, because what I've tried to highlight in terms of one of the big take-home points is that Islamist activity, political violence more broadly, and also Muslim-identified violence are very specific phenomena. They're very specific dynamics, and they are responding and emerging in different areas. And the fact that they're showing different results in these quantitative and statistical tests indicates that they are robustly being driven by different aspects. So I think that's one of the big take-home points in terms of policy for anyone engaging in these areas, to understand that how we frame and understand and conceive of Islam or Muslim majority context should be informed by the fact that even in Muslim majority areas that experience political violence, not all of it or very little of it is Islamist related, and that is a very specific phenomenon that needs to be understood and approached both from a policy and a theoretical perspective in very different ways. And the second is that I think there are implications from this research and from a lot of research going on in conflict event data about the scale at which we talk about these problems. So there's a tendency in particular in terms of Islamist violence to think of it as a very transnational phenomenon, and there's some truth to that certainly, but there's a tendency to conceive of this phenomenon in terms of a highly mobile, militant sort of activity that is in some ways sort of divorced from the local context on the ground, that it's highly fluid across porous borders, and to conceive of it in regional terms. So the Sahel is an example of how the developments in Mali in recent months have led to sort of discussions of a regional Sahelian crisis. And I think that this data encourages us to look to a greater extent at the subnational characteristics of an area. So as in a policy approach to maybe interrogate some of the assumptions that we make when we talk about regional dynamics, when there are very important intra-regional variations between, for instance, Sahelian countries that experience high levels of Islamist violence and those in the Sahel that experience very little. It also encourages us to maybe interrogate constructs like the failed state and some of these notions at the national level that maybe obscure variation within, for instance, northern Nigeria, which experiences high levels of Islamist violence, and north-central Nigeria, which experiences high levels of Muslim-identified violence. So yeah, I think those would be the two implications in terms of policy framing that I think are important.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you all for submitting your questions. Caitriona, do you have one big thought? If we could have one takeaway from your presentation, what's your closing thought?
Well, I guess, as I said, I think in terms of how we frame this, I think it's really important to take away that point about Islamist and Muslim-identified violence and political violence more broadly being very different. And I think that while the assumption isn't always made explicit, it's often found, I think, implicitly in policy or in even in academic work and elsewhere, journalistic writing. There's an assumed relationship between the size of a Muslim population or the fact that a country is a Muslim majority or a Muslim dominant country and certain types of violence. And I think that's often an implicit rather than an explicit assumption. And I think that where that is the case or where those relationships exist, it's important to identify what those mechanisms are and to interrogate those assumptions rather than to take them at face value, and to encourage sort of critical thinking and analysis of what might be driving that. So I hope that this is one way of showing the differences within different types of political violence, and also encouraging that kind of critical engagement with those ideas.